It's a delight to be here tonight, and thank you for coming out. As Boon Hui mentioned to you just a few minutes ago, we're here to celebrate the 60th anniversary and also the forthcoming catalog. We hope it will be out in November for you to buy, Treasures of Asian Art. And many of you may have known our previous catalog, Treasures of Asian Art, the Asia Society's Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Collection, which was published in 1994 and written by my predecessor, or one of my predecessors, Denise Patry-Lady. And Denise's catalog, we used Denise's catalog as a basis and then were able to update and expand it following new research and also additions to the collection. So what I'm going to do with you today is look at a few selected examples that show some of the changes or some of the questions that have arisen or continued to be in our minds over time since the original Rockefeller bequest came to us. And that bequest came after Mr. Rockefeller's untimely death in 1978 with a sort of foundation group of about 256 objects. Sometimes you'll see this number vary a little bit. It depends on how you count the objects. For example, we have a set of 2 Korean cups and saucers. So is that 4 objects, or is that 1 object, or is it 2 objects? So that explains some of the discrepancy you sometimes hear. I think that when we look at the collection and as we go through, I think that as Boon Hui says, these are works. The Rockefeller works are extraordinary works that reflect kind of the pinnacle of artistic production from all over Asia. But I also think that it's a group of objects that allows us it allows for a couple of different or several different narratives that we can build. And as we've built the collection, we've been thinking about those narratives and keeping those narratives in the back of our minds. And I'll be touching on this as we go through. I wanted to, okay, so, whoops, why are you here? Okay. So that is the cover on the left-hand side of the first Treasures of Asian Art, and on the right-hand side is the updated version that Michelle and Yuen and I worked to produce. And I wanted to start here with one of the fabulous pieces from the Rockefeller collection, this fantastic Ganesha. And while I don't have much to add in terms of our understanding of this particular piece, we know, of course, Ganesha is the remover of obstacles and a deity of prosperity. And for my purposes here, introducing the new catalog, is the Lord of New Beginnings. We know that he probably would have been in a prominent position on the exterior wall of an Indian temple. We know that he's the son of Shiva, and who is, of course, one of the three most important deities of the pantheon, the Hindu pantheon. But if you look at these 2 images here, you're looking at what is, in fact, a before and after image. And one of the things that I had the privilege of observing and kind of overseeing was the cleaning and conservation of Ganesha. And I think you can see from the slide on the left that it's really blackened over time through touching, through handling, through exposure to natural elements, perhaps the anointment of some kinds of things like ghee and other kinds of offerings, ghee, honey, so on. And essentially what happened was that all of that grime that started to coat the surface of the sculpture ended up covering up some of the original decoration on the piece. And when we had it cleaned about, I guess it was about five or 6 years ago, when it was conserved, what happened, actually some of the color, so probably this would have been originally painted quite brightly, and some of the color was revealed in places that you couldn't see it before. And as you know, he's downstairs in the lobby, so go and take another look at him. You can see much more clearly these rats on the bottom. And also, something that you can see in much more detail on his legs is his lion skin skirt, which was really largely obscured by grime before. So this allows us to see even more of the magnificence of the sculpture. And we have, of course, cleaned it without going overboard. We don't want to sand everything down to make it completely spick and span and shiny and new, but rather just in better shape so that you can see it closer, in a way that's closer to the way it originally looked. So I'm going to move on to some of these other examples from the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection, and that we've sort of rethought a bit over time. And this piece is very, very small ivory, beautiful ivory carving from the 8th to 9th century of the god Indra visiting the Buddha Shakyamuni. And in the previous version of the catalog, this was simply identified as Buddha Shakyamuni, and it wasn't quite clear as to whether this was scenes from the Buddha's life or perhaps God Indra visiting the Buddha Shakyamuni. But I think that upon closer observation, it becomes very much evident that this is indeed a scene that shows the Hindu god Indra visiting Shakyamuni. And there's a story that he visited the Buddha while the Buddha was meditating in a cave. And if you look here at the lower right-hand corner, as I speak, it is said that at Indra's request, Pankasika, that's the Gandharva Pankasika, and other Deva gods accompanied him. And then at his Indra's specific request, he asked that Pankasika play his harp and sing a love song. And the reason he asked Pankasika to do this was in order to distract the Buddha so that he would cease to meditate. I think you can see very clearly, very clearly here that indeed what we have here is a figure whose face we can no longer see because there's a piece missing, but clearly playing a harp. And then we see these repeated figures of someone who seems to be exactly the same figure, most likely Indra in this case, who has a meditation strap strapped around him, sometimes in slightly different positions. So according to the tale, after the Buddha was distracted by this harp playing and singing, a theoretical discourse between the Buddha and Indra followed. with the Buddha ultimately revealing to Indra that only those who have no craving and also have no bonds and have a perfect, have no bonds and are perfect in holy life can achieve enlightenment. And as a consequence of this discussion, Indra was converted to Buddhism. And I think so what we're seeing here is that Indra, after being converted to Buddhism, then he proceeds to meditate in the hopes of attaining enlightenment himself. Another piece that has been really a bone of contention surrounding this piece with scholars over time, and some going back and forth. And in the previous catalog, this piece was identified as coming from Myanmar or Burma. It's a small stone image with scenes of the Buddha's life on it, and you can see, at the middle, of course, you have the Buddha in his earth-touching mudra. So this is the moment in which he calls Earth to witness of his defeat of Mara, who had been trying to prevent him from becoming enlightened. And then all around other scenes relating to his life. Now, this is made out of a kind of stone, or carved out of a kind of stone called pyrophyllite. And what helps to make this such a puzzling case is that pyrophyllite, which is sometimes called andagu, in reference to the Burmese pieces, is found in places that are as far apart as northeastern India and Burma, and it's also found in Yunnan in China. And similar small sculptures sharing stylistic characteristics with this piece, and also the art of Bodh Gaya, so the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in India, that are carved in pyrophyllite, have been found. They've been found in a number of different places, including in Myanmar. And I think that probably because of that, this piece was determined to be to have come from Myanmar. Now, we know that the piece, before it went into the Rockefeller collection, it was in a Japanese collection, and Rockefeller bought it from a Japanese dealer. But what's also an interesting clue on this piece is what you see right here on the back of the piece. And you can see on the back of the piece, this is the letter A, or the letter for A in Tibetan. And it's often associated with the sound Om, so associated with Buddhism. Now, it's possible. We know that Bodh Gaya was a great center for Buddhist learning around the time this was produced, between the 11th and 12th century. We also know that Pagan, which was at its height during this period in Myanmar, was a great center of Buddhist learning as well. And certainly it's possible that a Tibetan went to Burma and then brought this piece back to Tibet, or that a Burmese monk or merchant could have brought this piece from Burma to Tibet. But I think it's much more likely that that a Tibetan monk traveled to Bodh Gaya, or somebody traveled from Bodh Gaya to Tibet, and then brought this piece there, and then it wasn't inscribed. And certainly the elements, the stylistic elements that one sees in this piece are very, very typical of Bodh Gaya. And this is very much kind of almost like a kind of tourist piece that would have been produced, very high-level tourist piece, but a kind of tourist piece or replication that would have been produced at the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. And then, speaking of Burma, also in this collection, this 14th to 15th century piece, Buddha Shakyamuni with kneeling worshippers, again, this moment when he touches the earth after having defeated Mara. And now, having done our Buddhist Art of Myanmar exhibition, I think that it's very clear that this is a very typical piece of the Ava period in Myanmar, where this sculpture was produced. We can see those typical standard stylistic qualities from this period: a short neck, a slim waist, the broad shoulders, and also very, very typical of sculptures from this period and from this part of the world, a pedestal that is in the shape of the cosmic Mount Meru, the axis of the Buddhist universe. You can see it's waisted. It has a waist, which is very typical stylistically. You see similar things in Thailand as well, of course. And then at the bottom, we also see emphasized the earth goddess who is wringing out her hair to wash away the hordes. And certainly this earth goddess one sees as part of tableaus, and also frequently together with Buddhist images like this one with the scene on them in Myanmar, and in fact certainly much more frequently than one does in East Asia, for example, and in India as well. And you can see the Buddha is flanked by his disciples Moggallana and Sariputra. Now, this piece, the Bodhisattva Maitreya from Thailand, is a piece that many have consider to this day the jewel in the crown of the Rockefeller collection. It is a truly spectacular, large piece. And for many years it was associated with a site in Thailand identified as Prakhon Chai. In northeastern Thailand. But in fact, in 2002, the scholar Emma Bunker identified or was able to publish research that she'd done in the area, and she'd gone back to the site. This was a site that was or these pieces were unearthed in 1964. This is one of a number of group of pieces that was unearthed at the site, and she was able to find the original temple site, and then was able to correct the misidentification. So this is actually, as you can see, the name of the temple site is actually Prasat Hin Khao Plat Bat number 2 site, and it's actually to the southwest of Prakhon Chai city. Nevertheless, we can see that the sculpture still has characteristics that we associate with the 8th century, a mixture between Khmer styles, that sort of very smooth, supple-looking, slender body, and also Mon style, this much more a kind of style associated with a particular ethnic group. And you can see that in some of the facial characteristics, like the thicker lips, the wider nose, and so on. Now, the Rockefeller collection has, as you can see in this group of blue and white wares, or wares colored with cobalt blue, many pieces of this type. And among the best known in the collection is this piece on the right-hand side, which is a Yuan Dynasty platter. And it has a really interesting provenance because it has an inscription on it that tells us that it was in the collection of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. And it's beautifully, beautifully painted with this underglazed cobalt blue. Well, what have we learned since the original publication of Treasures? Well, we know that that porcelain, so white, translucent, high-fired, sonorous ceramics were produced as early as the 6th century in northern China. Although they hadn't reached the perfection that we see years later with this Yuan Dynasty plate, where you have a really wonderful match between the hardness of the glaze and the body. Actually, the body and the glaze match themselves very well in these later porcelains in China, which is why they're so highly admired. But in this early period, in the 6th century, the glaze was not fired as a high a temperature. It was lower fired, so they weren't such a great match. But what is fascinating is that, since the publication of the catalog, is that although we knew around that time that there were shards that had been found of Tang period blue and white ceramics, whole ones had never been found in the past. And now, since 1998, with the discovery of the Belitung shipwreck off the coast of Java, we have examples of full plates with underglazed blue and white decoration. And one of them's on view here, and actually this plate is going to be coming to Asia Society in March with some other objects from the Belitung shipwreck in a show that we will be doing that will open for Asia Week. So we're really excited about that. And it's, of course, so interesting to see these two together, because we have here in the 9th century a very, very cosmopolitan period in China's history, where you're actually having trade, both land and sea trade, with the Arab world and the Middle East, and then again, much later in the mid-14th century, this is actually representative of the kind of piece that also might have been traded or given as a gift in exchange with dignitaries from that part of the world. And certainly the size of the platter suggests that it was made for that kind of a market, that kind of an audience as well. While I was on blue and whites, I just wanted to bring up this image of this other blue and white bowl. In addition to the initial Rockefeller bequest that came in, then over time there were a number of pieces that were added to the collection that came from Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller and from the estate of Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller, and this was one of those pieces. This is a beautiful Ming Dynasty Shwenda period bowl, first half of the 15th century. And you can see that it's decorated with this wonderful pattern of the three friends of winter, reflecting these high moral values of the Chinese scholar gentleman. And you can see here that it even has the mark of the period with Da Ming Xuande Nianzhi, so created during the Xuande period of the Great Ming Dynasty. I want to point out while these two are up that I'm really, really pleased that we actually have just made available our collection, our full collection online, thanks to the work of my colleague Nick Pozek, who has helped us with a large project that a number of us working with creating three-dimensional photography of our collection of our three-dimensional objects. So now if you go online to our Asia Society website, you can actually go to this piece, spin it around, zoom into it, and see it from every possible angle. So we have, everything. The nice thing about having a small collection like this is that it actually makes it possible to have every piece in the collection available at this level. So I do encourage you to go and take a look at that as well. This censer is a piece that is part of the original Rockefeller collection. It's a Song Dynasty, it had been identified as a late Song, perhaps early Yuan Dynasty ge ware, stoneware, so green glazed stoneware, beautiful piece. And since the original publication of treasures, there's been archaeological findings that allow us to much more precisely date the piece. In 1998 to 2001, the Hangzhou Archaeological Institute of Cultural Relics excavated the Lao Hongdong, the Lao Hudong, the Tiger Cave kiln that's in Hangzhou. And as they excavated, they found that there were shards that fell within the historical range of the Southern Song Dynasty, so between 1127 and 1279, to the Mongol period in China, 1271 to 1368. And we certainly know from the site that the Southern Song Celadon carves show that this Tiger Cave kiln was the site that was producing Song Dynasty official ware that's known as guanware. And guanware is quite similar to this type of ware, but we know that that the archaeology has showed us that there was actually a Mongol period strata of the site that contained ge-ware. And we know historically that when the Southern Song court fell, and after the unification of the Qin under Mongol rule, the Tiger Kiln maintained production. And the ceramic production that took place during this period, that is that period under Mongol rule, they began to produce a ware that was similar in style to guanware. And that's what we know as ge-ware, so this kind of ware. So now we can quite safely say that this piece is Yuan Dynasty and dating probably between the 13th and the 14th century. On the right-hand side, what I'm showing you there are some of those shards from that archaeological site in Hangzhou, the Tiger Cave, the Lao Hudong cave kiln. This is another piece that remains somewhat problematic in the collection. And when when Sherman Lee wrote his essay for the original Treasures Catalog, and we've reproduced it in the new Treasures Catalog as well, because I think that there's a lot of really interesting historical information, and they're related to Sherman Lee and the Rockefellers and his role as their advisor. But Sherman Lee in that essay writes, much also can be made of the stone tympanum with incised and raised relief of Shakyamuni Buddha preaching at Vulture Peak. This sculpture displays the complexity and sophistication achieved by the northern Chi artists of this region, and Tang achievements are very much indebted to the culture of the northern Chi. Now, we know from Sherman Lee's writings and also from his correspondence when he was urging the Rockefellers to purchase this piece, which is the piece on the left-hand side here, that he really was admiring this piece, which actually was in a Japanese collection and then ended up with the dealer Robert Ellsworth, and Ellsworth sold the piece to the Rockefellers. We know from early on there was a lot of discussion about this, because on the right-hand side here you see another piece which is very, very similar looking, and this piece was in the Art Institute of Chicago. And Sherman Lee thought that the Art Institute of Chicago piece was probably a copy of the Asia Society piece, which he thought was an original. Now, we can assume that probably which the original that this comes from, or the model that these come from, were placed above the doorways of a Chinese-style pagoda. So there probably originally would have been 4 of them, but I would assume probably with a different pattern on and different Buddha on each of them. It's still not clear to this day if, in fact, this is original or not. I think everybody's pretty much determined that this is the Art Institute of Chicago piece is a copy. But whether this is original or is not original still is questionable. Denise Leidy suggested that rather than a Northern Chi piece, it was probably a Northern Wei piece, and she says that is because there's a combination of very, very flat carving and then also more roundly rounded carving, more three-dimensional carving combined, which is an element that you see in that period. I've looked at the piece a number of times. I'm not entirely convinced. So I've actually moved this piece to the back of the catalog where it's in the sort of, we need to discuss this some more section. But I think it's easier to say that now that Sherman Lee is no longer with us. Another piece which Sherman Lee also found to be a really important piece, which continues to be really enigmatic, is this lobe dish with it's silver gilt with embossing. It's repoussé, and in the past it's been attributed to the Liao Dynasty. And having worked on our Liao Dynasty exhibition and looked at a lot of Liao period pieces, I have to say it doesn't look anything like any Liao pieces that I've ever seen. And I have a couple of pieces up here, which are from the tomb of Yelu Yujur and Chongun in the Inner Mongolian township of Alu Kuerchin Banner, datable before 942. And as you can see, the workmanship for this period is actually very, very detailed as well, but quite distinctive from what you see on this piece. And this work is really beautiful. And in the have this really kind of strange, primitive-looking, almost like a Warring States period scene with these horsemen mounted, these mounted men on horseback, and it's a really, really odd piece. So the question is this an authentic piece? Is it just some weird kind of fake? But if you were going to fake something, why would you put those two stylistic elements together? And then if it's not fake and it's not Liao, well, what is it? And I think that I'm curious to see what happens over time, because now there's starting to be much more research and more excavations in Western Asia. And I'm wondering, could it perhaps be earlier or later, and be something that has come from outside of what we consider China proper today? So this is a big question mark in my mind as well. Our beautiful Nomura Ninsei jar is also one of the stunning pieces in our collection, and one of the most important purchases that Rockefeller made. He purchased it in Japan, but had to get special permission to buy it because it had been designated as an important art object in Japan. And you can see that it has this beautiful design of these black birds. And in the past, this piece those birds on this piece had been identified as crows. And in fact, the identification of those birds as crows dated all the way back to the first quarter of the 18th century, when it was listed in a Japanese family inventory, and the decoration were called, those birds were called crows. But much more recent research, and research done by Oka Yoshiko for the Chigusa and the Art of Tea exhibition that took place at the Freer Sackler and then subsequently at the Princeton University Art Gallery, has shown that these, in fact, are not crows, they are myna birds. And that, of course, actually does make perfect sense in the Japanese context, where you often see myna birds as a decorative motif. And then, in addition, the research that he did for that exhibition, he was able to narrow down the dates even further for the piece. So now he has pinpointed this piece as being made in the 1670s, rather than the much more generic mid-17th century date that we had originally given to the piece. As I mentioned earlier, just check the time. As I mentioned earlier, new works have been added to the traditional collection since the original Rockefeller bequest. And I'm showing you here, these are Rockefeller pieces, Cambodian pieces that were part of the original bequest, including, if you look at these two, this piece here and this piece here, these two headless pieces, which are absolutely spectacular pieces, but are headless. They are pieces that date to the 11th century and are of a stylistic Bafuan type, and this piece was purchased with the help of Arthur Ross in 1981 for the collection, and it was really a nice addition to the collection because, of course, although it's not a complete piece either, you do have the face, and you can see that that you have some of those stylistic, those Mun stylistic features too on this piece. So that piece probably dating to the 11th century. And there are a few, or there were a few paintings, Indian paintings in the collection with the original bequest, which you can see here in front of you. In 1987, Asia Society had the opportunity to purchase this really spectacular manuscript. Here we see they were actually five leaves from a manuscript that that is beautifully, beautifully painted. And this manuscript from a Prajnaparamita Sutra manuscript has inscriptions that record in Sanskrit and in Tibetan the history of the manuscript from its creation at the famous Nalanda Monastery to its dedication for the benefit of a Tibetan nobleman as part of his funerary rites. And we can see the 8 great events depicted on this manuscript. And here I've just blown up for you this scene from the top here, where of course this is really, really tiny. The Buddha's birth. You can see the Buddha emerging from his mother's hip here, Maya's hip. In 2002, Asia Society was able to acquire 3 additional Indian paintings, including this one, which very unusually has the signature of the artist on it, Kesu Das, and is dated to 1589. And we know that this is a painting that would have been produced at the atelier of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And the subject matter is this woman with her child. And I've blown it up for you here. And I don't know if the child's eating a piece of pizza or a piece of naan, maybe more like. But you can see that clearly the artist was influenced by some Western etchings or prints that were available in India at this time. Of course, missionaries brought this kind of painting and Christian iconography as well to the Mughal ateliers, and that's what accounts for the shading that you see in the drapery, the receding background, and even these sort of unusual types of clothing that the woman is wearing here. Now, whether or not this was based on some kind of Madonna and child imagery originally, or some perhaps maybe just a more everyday domestic scene that was depicted in an etching or in a print, we can't be sure, but you can certainly see that influence. This is one of the other paintings. It is a page from an illustrated manuscript of the Bhagavata Purana, which tells of the life of Krishna, who you can see is repeated here and here. So you have a continuous or a narrative going on within the same framework. It's actually a beautiful night scene with silver paint to kind of endow the night sky with its velvety sheen. And this is, you can see Krishna's down on the bottom playing his flute for the gopis, the goat herd girls, or the cow herd girls. And then we see Krishna up above with his older brother chasing Shankashura, this shell demon, running after him there as he's abducted one of the gopis on his back. This is a manuscript that was produced in the Rajput court of Bikaner. This was a very powerful 17th century court that developed close relations with the Mughal court. Also from this group is this illustration to the Ramayana, wonderful illustration that shows us with Rama here getting ready with the monkey armies to go and rescue his consort Sita, who has been abducted and taken to Lanka by the demon Ravana. And again, you have a number of different parts of the narrative happening within one scene. Here, the waters have risen, and then they're about to recede so that they can cross over to Ravana. This is a kind of painting that we call Pahari, that developed when many Indian painters fled the courts of the rulers in the 17th century, in the 17th and 18th century, when many Indian painters fled the courts of rulers in the western Himalayas and set up court. They were driven by the instability of the Mughal courts at that time. And again, Rockefeller collection, quite a number of pieces from Nepal. This piece was purchased in 1983, a really wonderful image of Maitreya, who is, of course, the Buddha. He's worshipped as a bodhisattva and also as a Buddha of the future. And we know that he once had a full body halo because there's a loop on the back of him. This is a really small but beautiful, beautiful sculpture. And moving ahead, also in '92, another piece from Nepal that shows this image of Shiva and Parvati, this Uma Maheshwara, also showing the full family, Shiva and Parvati and their two sons. Ganesha is on the bottom dancing, and it also helps to, I was talking about narrative, and this helps us to connect the kind of imagery we have coming directly from India in the collection with the imagery from Nepal and the Hindu tradition in Nepal. Number of pieces from Tibet. We were able to purchase a Tibetan painting in 1991, which is our first and only Tibetan painting, this beautiful green Tara, datable to the 14th century. And, we added a sculpture thanks to the very generous gift of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Kinney in honor of Vishaka Desai in 2012. This wonderful piece from the Densatil Monastery, which would have originally been on this first tier of a Tashigomang stupa from one of these stupas at Densatil, which we also had an exhibition of, and we understand much more about now. This Sri Devi is obviously a fierce deity, and as one works one's way up the imagery on these Tashigomang, the beings and the purposes are for further and further and representative of higher and higher enlightenment. So this is from down on the bottom, where we're dealing with much more mundane kinds of concerns still. Related to the Phagmo Drupa Kaugyu school, so one of the main, related to one of the main lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, but a sub-lineage that actually no longer exists today. And although we have very bountiful holdings in South Asian and Southeast Asian and also Himalayan Buddhism, actually we don't have very much in the collection related to Chinese Buddhism. There was this head in the collection, and then in '92 we received, as part of the estate of Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller, this pair of bodhisattvas in a pensive pose, datable to the 6th century. And Korean art, we were also able to supplement in '89 with this really lovely stoneware ewer. We're used to seeing the green glazed celadons, the celadons of this period, but this is a stoneware, which is probably may not have been made for the aristocracy or the Buddhist or the Buddhist temple, the way that those green glazed wares were, but still is quite sophisticated and probably made for quite a wealthy family. And this storage jar came to us in '81 from Ambassador and Mrs. Richard Schneider, a really wonderful, large globular jar, datable to the 6th century, and representative of the kinds of things that were found in tombs at this time. Not clear whether this was actually meant to hold something or was simply created as a tombware. I'm just gonna flip through some more. In '90, beautiful painting of Buddha Shakyamuni preaching at Vulture Peak. So that same scene as we saw in that Chinese tympanum. This piece came from the estate of Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller on the left in '94, a Japanese piece that is Heian period, and back again. This is a piece on the left from the Art Institute of Chicago, and it's a kind of icon plaque called Kake Botoke, in this case with Kanon Bosatsu. In this case, this is the medicine Buddha. And as I was looking at this piece, I realized that there's a hole here and there are two holes here, and it's a small scale piece and relatively flat on the back. So clearly it was meant to be attached to one of these ornaments, and then those are hung in temples over a main image. And what's interesting about this piece too is that it's cast in bronze, but the hands are actually separate, and they're made out of wood. They may be later replacements, but they're made out of wood. White-robed Kanun in the 90s, and to our group of screens, we added this beautiful piece that's attributed to the Sotatsu school in 1985, so increasing our screen collection. And much more recently, we have a number of Nabashima-ware pieces from the original Rockefeller collection, and we were fortunate just last year to receive this gift from Richard Oldenburg, who actually received these Japanese Nabashima-ware dishes as a gift from Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller herself, and then thought it would be nice to give them to us so that they could have a home with other pieces from her collection here at Asian Society. And then finally, we've added, we have in the collection, the original Rockefeller collection had these 4 spectacular prints in the collection, and since prints can't stay out very often, I really felt strongly that we should start adding to the print collection. But of course, these are such iconic prints that I really thought it was important to add something that was on the same kind of level, and we were fortunate in being able to acquire this Hakusai print, Southwind, Clear Sky, from the famous 36 views of Mount Fuji. So I'm pretty much over time now, so I'm going to just end by saying that I will hope that you'll continue to enjoy and support the Asia Society collections and exhibitions for our next 60 years. And we have some really exciting plans for the future, so I'm looking forward to seeing you soon and after. Thanks for coming. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take a few questions. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Referring to,
Yeah.
to one of your earlier pieces that you had identified as from Myanmar and now say that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it is so typically from Myanmar, especially the earlobes and how they're touching the shoulders, which is so typically from Myanmar, that I'm surprised why you took it away from Myanmar.
The stylistic feature is something that you also see in Pala period art in India. And when the earlobes actually, I mean, we can go back to that piece, but I think when you're talking about the earlobes touching the shoulders, that's actually, you see that in Ava period, which is actually later than this piece is. So it's a, yeah, I mean, you do see the same features, and most scholars have now, for a long time, scholars were generally in agreement that these pieces were from Myanmar. Most people have shifted back now to India, to Pala period, but it is very hard to tell. I mean, because the Burmese had, they were sending monks to India at this time, They were bringing back works with them. They were copying works. As I said, the same stone is available there as is available in Myanmar. You know, why, you know, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, but my gut feeling, especially because of the Tibetan inscription, is that it's probably was made in India. Anything else? Thank you. Have a good night.